Road Trip live stream lecture. We're discussing the history of Hanukkah, and I am driving home right now with my tree in tow. So the rattling there is the tree that you may hear. But for the next hour or so, I'll be presenting on the historical topic of Hanukkah, one of the holidays that is celebrated in December, and I will be finishing this up, hopefully, in the comfort of my studio. So a very happy holiday season to you all. This is the last live stream. Actually, we're gonna be doing a special live stream on Tuesday afternoon before we get back from before the Christmas season. So this is the penultimate live stream before Christmas, but we're gonna be doing a special live stream lecture about some of the history around Christmas, as well as a Q&A. So that should probably be a 2-hour live stream or an hour and a half, and that'll be sometime on Tuesday, probably late Tuesday afternoon. So please join us for that. Looking forward to seeing you all there. But yes, so yeah, I didn't get my tree until just now, so I've got it rattling in my car. Long story about why I didn't get my tree. I mean, people used to not get their trees until like right before Christmas. One year I got it on Christmas Eve. So anyways, this is the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, where we bring history to you in a friendly, neighborly manner, 24/7, 365 or 366 days a year. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right, and I apologize for there being no video, but need to focus on the road a little bit right now. As I am driving home and bringing you as I am dashing through the snow in a one-horse open sleigh, want to bring you a very, very special live stream lecture that I think you all will hopefully really enjoy about the history of Hanukkah, probably the second most well-known holiday in this time of year behind Christmas. Hanukkah is a holiday that changes because the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, much like most of the Middle Eastern and Eastern world. Most of Asia, that's why the Chinese New Year always changes, that's why Ramadan always changes, is basing it on the lunar calendar rather than the solar calendar that is usually used, that divides into 12 months and 365 days and such like that. Well, they divide into that amount, but they're not, but they're subject to change based on lunar patterns and stuff about that. So yes, I am indeed going to be presenting and talking to you all about Hanukkah while I am driving, and hopefully that's not too much of a challenge, and hopefully we have better live stream connection than we did last week when I tried to present to all of you about the history of Hanukkah, one of the most important holidays. And I really apologize for last week's interruptions. I really had hoped that that would be a good presentation, but especially in light of what happened at Bondi Beach last Sunday. But still, this is very, very relevant. Hanukkah is still going on. In fact, tonight is the last night of Hanukkah. And just a little reminder about how Jewish calendars and Jewish days work. Evenings are the beginning of the new day. So it goes from sunset to sunset, and the sun has already set where I am. So it's 8:43 on the East Coast. So thank you for joining us for this relatively late live stream lecture at the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. And hopefully you all join us on Tuesday. I'm thinking maybe 7 p.m. Eastern for some holiday mirth and cheer as I talk about the history of Christmas. And on the Christmas Eve with the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel will always be nice, and there'll be a Q&A and stuff. A lot of fun stuff I've got planned for the holiday season with all of you guys and everything. But please check out our content, our shorts that drop every day, as well as our long form videos. We have ones that come out every Monday and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern. Check out my most recent one, my second to last one about the history of the U.S. Supreme Court. I hope you all really enjoy that. But please like and subscribe for more historical content as I get ready to present to you the history of Hanukkah. Now, the Festival of Lights wasn't originally called the Festival of Lights. It wasn't until Josephus is the first written source that actually identifies it as such. And he's writing in the later part of the 1st century, a patron of the Flavian emperors. He had originally been a leader in the Jewish revolt at which the Flavian generals Vespasian and his son Titus, both of whom became Roman emperors, had crushed. But anyways, so Hanukkah is, however, a celebration that predates the title of the Festival of Lights. And of course, calling it the Festival of Lights refers to the use of a candelabra called the menorah and the 8 candles that are lit during the Hanukkah season. Why there are 8 and why all of that matters, I will explain in a moment. It is based on history and a little bit of Jewish theology and mythology ground into that history. So in order to explain that, as I was explaining in the last live stream lecture that got interrupted about this topic, we have to understand a little bit of a history of Israelite people through Bible, but also other texts, as well as accounts were most likely a group of them that were in Egypt that were called slaves or Hebrews, and that's where the term Hebrew comes from. Supposedly, according to their text and their scriptures, they were freed by Moses, who brought them to Mount Sinai, and there received the commandments and the law from God. And that was the stipulations of how the Jewish people should live and what they should do. How much of that is historically reliable, we don't exactly know. But we do know that there is an Israelite Semitic presence in the land of Canaan that conquers the land of Canaan and removes different Canaanite peoples and eventually establishes a kingdom that is started by a man named Saul, but of course is known as the Davidic kingdom because of its most famous king, King David, the man from the David and Goliath story in the Bible. David's son Solomon supposedly builds the first Jewish temple, centralizing worship, and David captures the city of Jerusalem, making it the capital of the kingdom. Eventually the kingdom is divided into north and south, and in 722 the northern part of the kingdom, which is still called Israel, is conquered by the Assyrian Empire, and 135 years later the Babylonians conquer the south and destroy the first temple in 586 BC under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar II, or Nebuchadnezzar the Great, one of the greatest rulers in Mesopotamian, Middle Eastern, and ancient history. Nebuchadnezzar brings a host of captives to Babylon, to the Babylonian Empire, which is eventually conquered by the Persians. And in 539, the Persian Emperor Cyrus allows the Jews to return to the province of Judea and to begin building a new temple and build new cities and fortifications. And this becomes known as the Second Temple, which is completed by the end of the 6th century BC. And the Jews have a semi-autonomous region in the Persian Empire, but they are a province of the Persians nonetheless. And eventually the Persian Empire, as they had swallowed up the Babylonian empires, like many empires, are swallowed up by the Greeks under Alexander the Great, who destroys the Persian Empire, absorbs much of it into his own empire, dies, but spreads Hellenistic culture. Greek civilization becomes predominant all throughout much of the ancient world, including in the region of Judea, which is and Judah, and the ancient land of the Israelites. Now, the Greeks are obviously polytheistic. Their language and their culture is quite different, but their philosophy is influential on the development of Jewish social, religious, and moral thought. However, the Jews resist full assimilation with the Greeks, and they're not exactly gung-ho on being considered to be part of the Greek spheres of influence. After Alexander dies, there is what is called the Diadoche, which is a division of his empire amongst 4 different generals. The most successful of these generals is Seleucus, who is able to conquer a huge swathe of land in the Middle East, Turkey, and Palestine. So the Jews are under the domination of as a province of the Seleucid Empire. Although the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, which is the Greeks who control Egypt, they are able to control part of Israel for a while, but later it's taken over by the Seleucids. Eventually, a Grecian king by the name of Antiochus, originally from Syria, tries to implement upon the Jews the worship of Greek gods. He supposedly desecrates the temple, and this leads to the Jewish revolt, which lasts for several years between about 168 and 160, somewhere around there BC. So the Jews revolt against this imposition of Greek religion. The Jews are, as Judaism had been, are pretty much the first monotheists and are very adamant about worshiping only their God rather than the Greek gods. They aren't going to have things forced down their throats, so to speak. And this leads to the Jewish revolt. An old priest named Matthias encourages his son, especially his oldest, a man named Judas, to lead the revolt, and this becomes known as the Maccabees. This becomes known as the Maccabean Revolt, and it is eventually surprisingly successful, in driving out the Seleucid presence from their lands. The Seleucids are driven out, and by the Antiochus, the tyrant, is overthrown, and the Jews win a level of independence and autonomy in their area that they hadn't had for 600 years. They are no longer client states, being in the crossroads of the Egyptian empires as they had been for centuries, even when they were independent as the northern and southern kingdoms. They are a united kingdom, a reunified kingdom, and they are no longer a province and client state who are vassals to either the Persians or the Greeks. They are their own kingdom again, and this is known as the Hasmonean dynasty, which will rule over that region for the next 125 years. The Jews during this time, this is also during the time of the development of Second Temple Judaism, as it is known, Rabbinic Judaism, perhaps the most, the real early systematization of Jewish law, practices, and religion that will eventually form the basis of Rabbinic Judaism and the modern Jewish religion, Orthodox Judaism in particular. Now, this is centuries before Israel is called Palestine. This is centuries before the Romans have arrived. This is centuries before Islam, which has been the predominant force in the Middle East since its advent, is able to conquer the region. There is an independent Jewish state in that land that is kind of intimidated by the different powers nearby, the Seleucids, the Ptolemaics, and of course eventually the Romans. But they do have some level of autonomy, and this is where the story of Hanukkah comes in. Soon after their victory against the Greeks, the Jewish people decided to resume their religious practices, which had been, despite the desecration of the temple, they now felt encouraged to celebrate and give thanks to their God, who they believed had given them the victory over the much more powerful Greeks under Antiochus. This brings, and according to legend, this is where legend kind of meets the history. The story of Hanukkah goes something like this. The priests noticed that there was enough oil to light the lamp of a menorah for one night. And now, the menorah is a candelabra that would usually be lit throughout the year, but there was only enough oil to last for one night, and yet, so they decided to go ahead and light it for just one night, and this eventually turned into the fact that it lasted for 7 more evenings as well, and led to and this is the basis for the celebration of Hanukkah. So for the Jewish people, this was a miracle, and perhaps the real miracle had been their victory against their Greek overlords, their ability to resist empire and gain their autonomy and freedom from the Seleucids, rather than being able to simply just light the candle. There turned out to be more than enough oil for them to light for 8 nights in a row, and that completed the menorah, and that inspired the holiday. So celebrations of this holiday would continue for Jews throughout the centuries, and of course in the Second Temple. Now remember, the Second Temple had been built when the Jews had returned from exile under the guidance of the Persians in the early 6th century. Their religious autonomy had been threatened by the Greeks, who wanted them to convert to polytheism in the middle of the 2nd century, which had led to the Maccabean revolt. And so their miraculous victory against the much larger force of the Greeks, had inspired them to light candles and put the menorah on display. And this lasted 7 more nights than they had expected it to be. So ergo, the Festival of Lights was born. Now, what happens next? So this is not to last forever. The celebration seems to have continued and become a popular miracle amongst the Jewish people, and therefore taken on huge religious and cultural significance and impact, as stories of miracles and legends of survival tend to do. And Jews continue to celebrate their independence from the Greeks, the ability to remain autonomous and not to be destroyed by imperial powers, and their ability to worship God in the way they saw fit, and continue to persevere in their Jewish religion despite the diaspora, which had separated them originally, and the threats to their independence by the Greeks during the days of Antiochus IV and the Maccabean revolt. This is also soon after the time the Jews had codified their religious texts and eventually compiled not just Hebrew but Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, of the Torah. Of course, is for Christians the Old Testament. Well, the Jews have a level of autonomy while showing loyalty to them. Pompey the Great conquers the province, I think in about around 64 BC. Or 40, somewhere around there. Pompey is eventually hunted down by Caesar. The Egyptians kill him in order to placate Julius Caesar. As the alliance between Pompey and Caesar breaks down, and Pompey sides with the Senate to try to destroy Caesar's rising star. Caesar crosses the Rubicon, tracks Pompey all the way down after defeating him at the Battle of Pharsalus, and destroys him and his destroyed forces. Then he hooks up with Cleopatra, helps her overthrow her brother, and returns to Roman glory, where when he tries to make himself dictator for life, he is assassinated 4 years later, 4 years after his rebellion started. Eventually, Pompey had, I think it was Pompey. It was either Pompey or Mark Antony, who becomes the predominant leader of this area of the Roman world, who also gets together with Cleopatra, eventually gives power to a group of people who have half Jewish descent and half Moabite descent. The Moabites were one of the various different tribes that the Jews and the Israelites had fought against for centuries, and that was the rise of the Herodians, and Herod the Great takes power, and Herod is quite surprised that despite the fact that he sides with Antony in the civil war between Mark Antony and Octavian, Julius Caesar's nephew, the two men who had avenged Caesar's death and divided the Roman Republic basically into their own little empires, that despite the fact he sided with Antony and Antony was defeated in the next civil war against Octavian, Octavian was more than willing to let Herod continue to govern and control the new Roman province of Judea. Herod was a pretty paranoid individual from many historical accounts, may have been responsible for the murder of several of his sons, and according to the New Testament sought to kill the young baby Jesus, and ended up slaughtering a bunch of children because of it. The point being that so there was a lot of anchor and flux and change in Judea in the 1st century BC, yet the Jewish religion continued to remain. The Jews now, instead of being autonomous, the Hasmonean dynasty was over, the Herodian dynasty had begun, and they were semi-incorporated into the Roman Empire, receiving some measure of autonomy, but also heavily influenced by the Romans. Now, different schools of Jewish thought had emerged in Second Temple Judaism that had different ideas of how to interpret what was happening with the Roman Empire, now being the latest, biggest, baddest dog in the alleyway that was damaging them and threatening their freedoms. The main school of thought, the main leadership, was a group known as the Sadducees, who believed in cooperation with the Romans. There was a group called the Pharisees, who are well known for their encounters with Jesus in the New Testament, who believed that pure religious living and a following of laws would bring the Messiah, and the Messiah would deliver them from the Roman Empire and reestablish the kingdom of David. Of course, Jesus of Nazareth claimed to be this Messiah and was constantly opposed by the Pharisees because he claimed to be this Messiah and claimed to be a divine being. So, at least by the account of the Christian Gospels and Scriptures. So, these were influenced somewhat by Greek philosophy and developments and how you should deal with the Roman Empire, as religions cannot develop without the cultural, political, and historical context around them. Still, the Festival of Lights and Hanukkah were still widely practiced at this time, and there seems to be New Testament references to not just Jesus, but the early Christians celebrating this holiday as well. Jesus, at one point in the Gospels, refers to himself as the light of the world, which could be a passing reference to the menorah, the candelabra in the temple, the ever-burning light, and the miracle of the oil that Jesus would have been very well aware about, with Hanukkah coming about 150 years before his time. So, what happens next? Well, I'm glad you asked. Another school of thought had emerged amongst the Jews that was heavily resistant to Roman occupation. These were known as the Zealots. And the Zealots during the 1st century AD did everything they could to undermine the authority of the Romans. And they continued to spur on revolts and things like this. And the more revolts and the more insurrections against the Roman, the more freedom of the Jewish people. After a tetrarchy of 4 rulers was established, which divided it and decentralized allowing a Roman governor to come in and have as much power as the kings. And again, these men, like Herod and his family, were not kings in the sense that they ruled over the land. They were allowed to govern with some level of power and prestige only as long as they followed and did what Rome wanted them to do in the times of Augustus and then Tiberius Caesar. And of course, Octavian becomes Augustus. So, of course, Christianity develops around this time. Jesus is killed, supposedly, according to the Christian faith. He rises from the dead, and this kind of harmonizes with being Christmas time. And why am I talking about this? Hanukkah, the story of Hanukkah, I've already finished. Well, there's another development that is huge in the story of Judaism and their celebration of Hanukkah. And that is yet another diaspora is bound to happen. The continual revolts of the Zealots lead to more and more organized strife against the Romans, and in 66 AD, the Jewish revolt breaks out against the Romans. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, the Flavians, General Vespasian and his son Titus, who takes over after Vespasian goes to Rome to become the emperor, will seek to persecute or to prosecute the war and to defeat the Jewish revolt and insurgency and reclaim Judean dominance over Judea. And this is going to reduce the freedoms of the Judeans. It's going to end the Herodian line. And basically, at this point, the Jewish people are stamped out. The revolt lasts for about 4 or 5 years. Eventually, the Jewish temple is destroyed, decentralizing worship. Another temple has not been constructed since then. The Temple Mount has remained bare, or would remain bare, for about 6 centuries, until Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock were built by the Muslims in the 7th century after they conquered Jerusalem. So, as I just pull into my driveway. So, anyways, where are we? I'm going to take a quick pause to go inside and get situated. But basically, the Jews still occupy a large area of Judea. They still have the province, but they have lost all autonomy. They have lost the ability for any self-rule. The Roman Empire is crushing down more and more on them, and now there is a decentralization of their worship. The menorahs and candelabras are taken away by the Romans, and their plundering of, just look at the Trajan's Column, one of the most that celebrates his participation as an officer in that war early in his illustrious military career. Of course, he would later become the Roman emperor. Depicts the taking away of and plundering of different goods from the Jewish temple. What happens next? I'm sorry. Yeah. Anyways, so the Jewish people still have some sort of connection to the land, but they don't have a central place for worship. They don't have a central place to celebrate Hanukkah. And for many in the Christian faith, this is an official split between the Jews and the Christians. The Christians believe Jesus had said this would happen, and worship in the Jewish temple becomes something Christians are not doing, and Jews are not doing. Sacrifices for the Jewish religion tend to end. However, the practice of Hanukkah, which again started as a resistance against tyranny and imperialism, are all the more poignant for Jews who have been scattered and who are in Judea at this time, having lost their autonomy. They've also lost their center of worship. So losing their center of worship, they don't have a place to actually celebrate Hanukkah. So celebrations of Hanukkah are limited to homes, and later to the development of Jewish religious centers in different areas, which of course become known as synagogues, which were already quite common. Remember, the Assyrians and the Babylonians had scattered the Jews all throughout the Middle East and the known world. This continued under Alexander the Great and with the Romans as well. The Roman Emperor Claudius, who ruled about 20 years before the destruction of the temple, had expelled and deported all Jews from Rome. So there was Jewish presence all over the Roman Empire by the time the temple was destroyed. And these Jewish communities, since they couldn't go to the temple, had to find places to worship, and so they worshipped in different religious centers that were known as synagogues. They were also inspired by different sages who had different teachings and ideas and developed this systematically over time. These would be rabbis, and they would eventually gather a series of commentaries and understandings and clarifications on Jewish law, which would become known with the Gemara and the Mishnah as the Talmud. So you now have a codification in the centuries that follow of the other main Jewish text aside from the Torah, aka Old Testament. So anyways, I will be right back, and we will trace what happens after this to the Jewish people and how Hanukkah continues despite the coming diaspora once again for the land of Israel. So if you're enjoying this, please like and subscribe. And if you've got any questions, think about them, because I might have some time to answer them in just a few minutes. So I'll be right back in just a second. Okay, we are back, and I am in studio now. So thank you for bearing with us as we went over that. And here's a nice, good background of Hanukkah. And what I love about this background of Hanukkah, as I show you a clearer image of it, you have Greek war elephants and Greek soldiers, obviously represented with their spears. That would be the phalanx, the most dominant elite force before the legion in the ancient world, which had ran over so many different enemies, such as the immortals of the Persian army. Marching in the background in the front, you have the Jews centered around the menorah, the candelabra that they would use for worship. That obviously is central to Hanukkah. So, anyways, so the Festival of Lights continues to be practiced by the Jewish people, even in exile, even in the different areas of the diaspora, and will become more prevalent when a third diaspora happens in just about 60 years after the destruction of the temple. A series of continual revolts by different Jewish peoples will eventually lead to the Romans basically getting sick and tired of dealing with them, and the expulsion of the Jews from the land of Israel. By the way, people who bring up the 109 countries thing like they always like to do are mentioning how the Romans, Persians, and Babylonians and Assyrians expelled the Jews. So, anyways, what happens next? Well, the Jewish people still have a strong presence within the land of Palestine and are continuing to fight for their revolution. They believe more than ever that the Messiah is necessary to bring about freedom for them from the Romans and to overthrow the empire. They had already done this before. They feel that they can do this again. And eventually an old Jewish rabbi by the name of Bar Kokhba comes up with this idea and leads the Bar Kokhba revolt from 132 to 136, a very bloody and nasty affair, which resembles the struggles of the Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 AD as well. And this is pretty bad. So the Romans under the Emperor Hadrian basically decide that they are going to not only defeat these rebels, but they are also going to strip them of their land. In 136, the revolt is crushed, And Hadrian decides to expel many of the Jews from the province of Judea and to rename it, to strip it of its identity. Jerusalem is renamed Area Capitolina, and a Roman temple is built there. And the province is renamed Syria Palestina as an insult to the Jews based on their ancient foes, the Philistines, the sea people who had fought against the Davidic kingdom that I mentioned earlier. So the so the Jewish people are once again diaspora. They are thrown out on their ear. They have no temple, no centralized worship, and now they have no country. They have a homeland, but they have no country to call their own. They don't have any autonomy in that country. They've gone from full autonomy before the Romans showed up to none now whatsoever. What happens next? The Romans, it's a series of empires fighting over this land, starting with the Romans. Later, the Byzantines will inherit it from them. Eventually, the Muslim caliphates will come. The Crusades will come and take it back shortly, and the Muslims will have a predominant control over the land until the 20th century, with the rise of the Zionism and the Jewish home state, where Jews return to the land and continue to celebrate Hanukkah, but the temple has not been rebuilt. And thank you for welcoming me home, and for the super chat, Amir. Always appreciate it. But before that, the Jewish people are spread out all over the world, and this leads to the development of the three major types of ethnic Jews in the world. The Ashkenazi Jews, which are the majority of the world's Jews, who are mainly centered in Europe, along with the Mizrahim Jews of Egypt and parts of the Middle East, and the Sephardic Jews of North Africa and Spain. And these different types of Jews will develop their own different traditions, but many of them will come to celebrate the Festival of Lights. Like I mentioned, in the centuries that follow, the Talmud is created. There's the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmud, with the Babylonian one becoming the predominant one in the Jewish religion. Rabbinic Judaism, synagogal Judaism become quite common in the diaspora, and the religion is reformed and reshaped over time to reflect the loss of the temple and the spiritualization of many of the practices and sacrifices of the Old Testament, where emphasis is put on the law. The Pharisaical school of religious purism tends to win out, especially at first, and this leads to the development of what we could eventually call the beginnings of Orthodox Judaism, if you want to think of any modern comparisons to this. And yet, different Jews with different traditions and cultural attachments in different areas, idot as they are called, develop very different practices and ways of celebrating their Jewish identity. And Hanukkah remains a light for them, quite literally, in remembering how they were able to topple and defeat an empire and retain their independence despite all of the difficulties that they encountered at the hands of the Greeks. And the fact that they lost their land later to the Romans does not make a dent in their desire to once again overthrow empire and have a chance to live on their own in peace and harmony without worry of being destroyed or their lives, culture, and religion challenged by overbearing, powerful forces. So, the Jewish Hanukkah continued to be, it was celebrated by Jews in the different enclaves in the different areas of the world that they went, despite suffering horrifying forms of persecution at the hands of Christians and Muslims and other groups of people. Ashkenazi, Mizrahim, and Sephardic Jews continued to practice it, as it is seemingly an antidote to persecution, with the hope of a light eventually appearing for the Jewish people, which will deliver them from their sufferings and their problems, and has taken on a lot of significance in both the United States, which eventually came to have the world's largest Jewish population for quite some time, and of course in the Zionist context of the reclaiming of the land of Israel as their own, as the empires have come and gone, the Romans, the British, the Ottomans, and all the others, and the Jews are back in the land with their own state. So Hanukkah has become more and more of a popular religion in American culture and society because of a large influx of Jews to the United States in the late 19th century during the Great Wave of Immigration between about 1880 and 1920. With many Jews fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe, these Ashkenazi Jews set up shop in some of America's biggest cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Boston, and developed their own neighborhoods, cultures, and identities, and part of that was the celebration of Hanukkah and the displaying of the menorah. Despite facing a large amount of bigotry, anti-Semitism, and persecution at the hands of the various of their host population, Jews found themselves to have more religious and political freedom in the United States than they had at any other place. This still did not, but still many Jews yearned to return home. Theodor Herzl, upon seeing the mistreatment of Alfred Dreyfus at the end of the 19th century at the hands of the French government simply because he was a Jew, basically reasoned that the only place Jews could ever be safe is if they had their own homeland. And their own homeland, they believed, was in the land of Palestine. This would eventually become easier for them to do once an influx of Jews started moving there and the Ottoman Empire was destroyed in the Great War. Now, I don't want to get into the controversy of Israel-Palestine and all of that, but basically, Hanukkah has been celebrated as a reflection of their accomplishment of regaining that land since May of 1948, when the United Nations declared the State of Israel. The British mandate ended, and the United Nations declared the creation of the State of Israel under the leadership of Yuri Ben-Gurion, which triggered the Arab-Israeli War, and in many ways, the Arab-Israeli conflict that lasts to this day. So, Hanukkah continues to be a remembrance and celebration for the Jewish people. It is a holiday that has become quite popular in the United States, and of course also in Israel as well, which now has surpassed the United States as the most populous Jewish population in the world, and the only ostensibly Jewish country in the world. So, there's a little bit about Hanukkah and its impact on Jewish people. Of course, in the diaspora, it was huge for them to celebrate their culture, to celebrate their victories, to celebrate their previous glories, and to remember what had happened. And the miracle represented not just their ability to have enough oil in their lamp for 8 days, but also the ability of a very small people who were constantly being targeted and oppressed to overthrow their oppressors. So, there's moral lessons, personal lessons, and all sorts of wonderful applications that Jews have made with Hanukkah in the centuries that have passed. Of course, when you have a religion that is that old and a celebration that is old, and rabbis who are bound to comment about everything, you're going to eventually develop a certain different religious and social traditions that you will practice, some of them being different in different parts of the world, because the Jewish diaspora, the first one caused by the Assyrians, the second by the Babylonians, and the last major one by the Romans, allowed the Jewish people to spread to integrate with different cultures in different areas of the world. So, anyways, that is a brief, condensed history of Hanukkah, the Jewish festival of lights, which of course is being celebrated right now and has one more day to go on it. So, and anyways, I hope you really enjoyed that, and if you did, please like and subscribe. And I have about 25 minutes left, so I will be answering any questions you have about history or social sciences. And hopefully hopefully these questions can be about Hanukkah, because I'd be happy to answer them. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat, and I will be happy to answer them. And finally we got home. Finally we got everything out of the way. So yes. Thank you for enjoying it. I really appreciate that. Sorry about your chinchilla, a very, very active chinchilla. A what-if question. What would happen if the Israelis blew up the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount? Jeez. That's almost one of those questions where it's so politically charged I want to charge a super chat for it. Basically, the Dome of the Rock in Al-Aqsa Mosque is the commemorative site of the night journey where Muhammad supposedly was brought to heaven and was able to meet Allah physically. And has made Jerusalem an extremely significant place for Muslims as much as it has for Jews and Christians. It was built soon after the death of Muhammad, which coincided with the Islamic conquest of Jerusalem and the land of Palestine, from taking it away from the Byzantine Christian Empire, which had been basically were the Eastern Romans. Why are you scared to go further starting from 1948? Too controversial? No, my lecture wasn't about the history of Israel. If you want to hear a lecture about the history of Israel, I've talked about it plenty on the channel. Plenty of people have many questions about it, and I've delved into the controversial stuff. I'm talking about Hanukkah, and how Hanukkah now has a new meaning for Jews who are celebrating their seeming victory over the empires in the past by having a free and autonomous state again. So you could argue that this lecture is really about the autonomy of the Jewish people in the land of Israel or Palestine. In the Second World War, what if France actually invaded Germany from the west, told Poland to mobilize, and got a strong government, and made the people want war and was no longer shell-shocked? I don't know. It might have been different, but the French really didn't know what they were doing in that war. What's your favorite point in history to look into? I love looking into Russian history and European history in the 19th and 20th centuries. Why did China and Vietnam become communist? The communists in China basically offered redistribution of land, peasantry rights, and they basically appealed to the peasant class, which was the underclass, but also the majority of people in the country were peasants. They became much more open to the idea of communism because they were used to being mistreated by the nationalists, who were their rivals in the Civil War. So basically, by appealing to the largest common denominator, Mao was able to achieve victory there. French oppression of the Vietnamese and the refusal to give them their freedom made Ho Chi Minh and his freedom fighters look less communistic and more like people who actually cared about the freedom of their people, which they did. The French are useless. You can't expect them to do anything. Yes, except like conquer almost all of Europe in the 19th century, something the British never did. Let me see here. Is this asking a question or is it about Jewish history? It's a lecture that turned into a question. Well, let me see. Yeah, get some rest, Harry. Today is the night that we Persians and also Kurds and some Turkic people celebrate our holiday Yalda. But in the story of Easter in the Hebrew Bible, us Persians are the bad guys. You're thinking of you're of Esther in the Hebrew. It's not the Persians that are the bad guys. It's certain Persians. Not all the Persians are bad guys. And yes, it's good to see you. Do you feel really bad for Poland as it was partitioned for saving Europe in Vienna in 1920 because they genuinely wanted to save Austria and was paid back with annexation? Sure. Is communism what Soviet Union sold Asia in alignment with Marx? They tried to, but yeah, never wanted to. Actually, the British did want to do it. They just couldn't do it because they weren't as good as the French when it came to fighting land wars in Europe. So, anyways, let me see. Persians were the only ones who brought them back to their land. That's true. They didn't expel them, but they were seen as the empire. So the Jews never really assembled much of an empire themselves. So imperial powers were often seen with animosity. There are plenty of stories that see the Persians as the good guys in the Book of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament, for instance. Because people think I'm a Nazi, which I definitely am not by any stretch of the imagination. You're a National Socialist. You're a nationalist and a socialist. So, when did the British want to conquer Europe? When did the British not want to conquer Europe? Albert Einstein was Jewish. Yes. When was that ever the goal of British foreign policy? I don't know. But if you had wanted to, you wouldn't have been able to. The French had dealings in China. I thought it was just Cambodia. Laos in the last one. No, Vietnam. I was talking about Vietnam. The Italian Wars is a good one. Look into Granada Muslims banished from the Iberian Peninsula. Yes, thank you for bringing that up again. Let me see here. Do you like Cheeto? What do you mean by Cheetos? You mean the chip? Sure. Hold on. What's going on?